Okay, the next panel, and that's one that I shall be moderating, or doing my best to moderate, is on climate change and international cooperation, educating in a contested space. And I'd like to invite our three panelists to please come up and take a seat at the table there, and I will do the introductions. So I will start from the far side. We have Professor Jun Arima, who's also the sitting president of IAFOR. He is the senior academic officer of the organization and chairs the International Advisory Board and sits on the board of directors. I met Professor Arima about 13 years ago in Brighton. When we invited him down, he was the Director General of JETRO, which is the Japan External Trade Organization, and a special advisor on global environmental affairs for the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in METI in Japan from 2011 to 2015. He's had a career that's been in both bureaucracy administration within the Japanese government, and positions overseas. But he's a noted expert on energy policy, and the environment. He's currently a visiting professor now at the University of Tokyo, where he teaches energy security and issues around energy governance. And he's flown in from Japan to speak for us, and he will be getting a flight back just after this panel. So thank you very much, Jun, and I hope you're at least able to enjoy some rest on the way back on the plane. Miss Bernice Lee, pleased to meet you. I don't think we've met, but Miss Bernice Lee is Distinguished Fellow and Senior Advisor at Chatham House, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's not too far from here, and it's St James's. An independent policy institute which is based in the UK and has a long and storied history. She chairs the advisory board of the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator and Bellwethers Group, a non-profit organisation that activates influential networks to accelerate action on climate and nature. She also serves on the boards of Energy Foundation China and Chapter Zero Alliance. She's been Director of Climate Change at the World Economic Forum and Director of Chatham House's Energy Environment, Global Economy and Finance Programs, and the Hoffman Centre for Sustainable Resource Economy. She's also held positions in the UN Secretary General's Office, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Aga Khan Foundation, as well as on the Children's Investment Foundation's Climate Change Advisory Board, Shell's External Review Committee, Nestlé's Sustainability Council, Vale's CEO Sounding Panel, and the UK Climate Change Committee's International Advisory Group. So welcome to the panel, Bernice. And last but not least, we have Mr. Anthony Froggatt, who is Senior Director for Aviation, Energy and Shipping at Transport and Environment in Belgium, a Brussels-based NGO advocating for clean transport and energy. He previously served as Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow in the Energy, Environment and Resources Department at Chatham House, also where he focused on global energy policy and the geopolitics of climate change, including research on the energy and climate policy implications of Brexit. So this is our panel. It's a quite exceptional panel to be discussing this, and thank you very much for agreeing to take part, because I think perhaps for some of the panelists this is an unusual setting for them to be presenting in and to, but one which we thought was really important because it links in to one of the overarching thematics of this conference, which is ways in which we can address enormous problems that transcend culture, transcend country, transcend these boundaries. And so we're looking at climate change and international cooperation, educating in a contested space. I'm going to read the paragraph to set the scene, and then we're going to go on to 3 short presentations, followed by a moderated questions, and then that should leave about 20 minutes for your questions to the panel. So here is the setup. Climate change remains one of the most urgent and complex global challenges, demanding rapid, coordinated action across national borders. With the United Nations 30th Climate Change Conference, the COP30, on the horizon, this panel would explore the critical role of international cooperation in advancing climate action. It will discuss the role of education in fostering this dialogue, assisting people in making informed decisions, and cultivating negotiating skills. The panelists will give their opinions on the successes and limitations of current multilateral frameworks, such as the Paris Agreement, and examine the evolving expectations for COP30, including the need for stronger binding commitments within the revised NDCs and transparent accountability mechanisms. By fostering dialogue among academics, experts, and civil society, this panel aims to identify practical pathways for enhancing global solidarity and ambition in the lead up to the COP30 and beyond. So we will get the ball rolling with presentations. My understanding is no one has slides, correct? Perfect. I love no slides presentations because they can't go wrong. or at least the slides can't go wrong. Okay, I will move over there. And have we decided who's going first?
No.
No?
No.
No. Well, you can fight it out.
You go.
Over the next, you can negotiate it out over the next 3 seconds.
Okay, so then can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Joe, for a kind introduction. And I'm going to talk about my prospect and the forecast about COP30. And COP30 aims to reach agreement on such various things, including global goal for adaptation and other matters. For example, TOR of the UAE dialogue or work program of just transition and so forth. And actually, I attended the subsidiary body meeting in Bonn this May, preparing for the COP30. And as usual, a sharp disagreement arose between developed and developing countries over such issues as public support from developed countries to developing countries and the handling of unilateral measures such as carbon border adjustment measures. And to my mind, prospects of COP30 are really challenging due to, I say, 4 gaps. First gap is ambition gap. As countries submit their NDCs, revised NDCs to the United Nations Framework Convention ahead of COP30, it is very much unlikely that the aggregation of these commitments will align with a pathway to achieve the so-called 1.5 degrees Celsius goals. And to achieve 1.5 Celsius goals compatible pathway, we need to reduce global emissions exceeding 8 to 9% per annum from now to 2035 and beyond. And the feasibility of such a drastic reduction is simply, to my mind, impossible because the global emission during COVID-19, very challenging period for us, was just 5.8% less than 2019. So 8-9% reduction every year from now to 2035 and beyond. That sounds very mission possible to me. And then a second, financial gap. Such drastic reduction also calls for reduction of developing countries' emissions from current level in absolute terms. And this requires massive financial assistance from developed to developing countries. At the COP29 last November, developing countries expressed their very strong disappointment about a negotiated outcome on so-called new collective quantitative goal, NCQZ, of $300 billion. And additionally, the Trump administration withdrew from Paris Agreement and halted all the financial contributions to the UNFCCC. Furthermore, developed countries are currently increasing their defense budget, further reducing public funds available for supporting developing countries. So the third gap is priority gap. According to a UN survey, the priority given to climate actions among 17 SDGs radically differs across the countries, in particular between developed and developing countries. For example, in Sweden, climate action, SDG 13, receives highest priority among 17 SDGs. But in China, the priority on SDG 13 is 15th out of 17. So clearly, there is a marked difference as to the priorities on different SDGs, reflecting the development stage and also different national circumstances. And the final gap is willingness gap. And according to the survey by the Japan Trade Union, the Confederation, Rengo, last September, only 46% of respondents indicated support to accept increased energy payment for climate change mitigation. And even among those willing to accept energy expense increase, 80% of them stated that they could only accept the increase of energy bill less than 8% per month. So comparing with the drastic carbon price necessary for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, this willingness to pay gap is very serious. And this is the case in Japan. So therefore, the willingness to pay in developing countries will be further lower. So all in all of them indicates that the prospect of COP30 is very much challenging. I have been following UN climate negotiation for more than 20 years, and COP30 this November will be my 20th COP to attend. But from that experience, I have to say the outlook of COP30 is not at all, optimistic. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing there. So ambition gap, priority gap, and willingness gap. Okay, Bernice, would you like to?
Oh, happy to. Very happy to. Thank you very much. I especially love the idea that we've got such a large gamut of obstacles put in front of us. I think at the moment it's pretty clear, isn't it? That by the way, is this Chatham House rule?
On the record? Oh, I think this is probably not Chatham House.
So it's on the record, that's fine, yeah. So the world is suffering from a bad boss syndrome, right? Half the world thinks that they're feeling really demoralized and they don't really want to get organized because they have a pretty bad boss. Now, what is interesting for me is that last week in Seville, at the Finance for Development conference, where when the bad boss decided to leave the room, suddenly the rest of the world decided that, well, actually, maybe we do have more in common than we thought we did. No, so let's start with that. So we have a bad boss syndrome for half the world. The other half of the world is thinking, well, actually, we're not entirely sure we want a boss at all. And if we didn't want a boss, how do we then share power and co-create the future system? So that's kind of where we are today, which is where I'm going to start with, which is that geopolitics is often described almost as a law of physics. That's something you can't do anything about it, but obviously, in reality, it's a system that is evolving, something that we have to create. This means that if we treat fragmentation and rivalry not as inevitable, what would your bet be? The reason for that is not because I care enough more about climate change than anything else in the world. That's not true. I care about peace and security. I care a lot about cost. I care a lot about the fact that we did not find a way to pay for the green premium as well. But what I also know for a fact is that climate impacts haven't stopped. We see the floods. We see the heat wave. We know nobody is paying for it, by the way, not just in poor countries. No one's paying for it here either. What about all the productivity loss in Europe as well? No one at the moment is currently covering the cost of all the impacts of climate at the moment, which is why I'm quite convinced that this is why we have to find a way to pay for this that goes beyond some of the theatrics that we do see in UN conferences. Now, it is not surprising that we get frustrated. Of course, it's not easy to get any processes with so many members and having to have unanimous conclusion to find a solution. Some people say that it's broken. Others want to replace it entirely. My kind of line that I've been using quite a lot over the years is that, sure, it's not working well enough. We're not really reducing warming enough. Sure, we don't find the money quick enough or sometimes even at all. But you know what? It is not working when you look at global temperature change, right? That if we were aiming at, well, we're heading for somewhere between 3.7 to 4, around the time of Paris. Right now, Anthony is, he is the bedrock of everything I know, by the way, just in case you didn't know that. But we are now heading towards about 2.7. Now, not great, obviously not great, but nonetheless, it demonstrated that since we came together as a world and thought that a global agreement could help drive at least some momentum, if not as quick delivery as we need it, it has demonstrated that it can do something. It actually has. I mean, what can I only consider to be the alchemy of internationalism and international cooperation is indeed mysterious in some ways. It's obviously not just about leadership. Sometimes we have leadership, as you can never be sure where they should come from. But at the same time, there's a question about momentum and delivery. And we are now moving very quickly from the ambition game into the delivery game. We have quite a lot of countries, including China. I mean, you mentioned China. Anthony probably would talk about China. That talks a lot about how it shouldn't be about targets, it should be about delivery and implementation. Now, everybody who wants to show us what that means to have an international system, international cooperation driven by implementation, will have a chance in Brazil in COP30 to demonstrate what it is. Now, the Brazilian government already talked about they wanted implementation to be key. They wanted to make sure that solutions lead, not just target setting. Now, all of this has to evolve. That probably does mean that we have to make sure that not just the public sector, but also the private sector are entering the accountability game in a slightly different way. The game is now, how do we create that system in such a way while making sure that what did work so far continue to work. I mean, Michael Jacobs, who was in the government in Copenhagen, I believe, he always said that even a COP that failed, such as Copenhagen, ended up with many different country investment plans around renewable, which is one of the many reasons why we have so many today. Now, I'm not going to pretend that any of this is easy. I am, however, saying that people who think that we should start again, unless they find a way to help create a system that doesn't actually require all the votes from all the different countries and yet at the same time still deliver, we recognize that the system is flawed. It might still be our best shot. If we have fewer theatrics, we've reformed the system to the extent that it makes possible quicker deliberations, fewer theatrics. I'm going to use the word theatrics in a very specific way because we all kind of know that rich countries don't have money in the pot either, right? I mean, let's be clear. And we certainly know that they could have chosen to spend it, by the way, which they often don't. So then the question becomes, if that's the case, how do you ease more out of it? I'm not entirely sure stopping the whole process is the way to get more resources into the system. So I think we all should be figuring out how do we do so that we're not just over-reliant as well on outside tracks while at the same time reforming the process within. One of the outside tracks that most people talk about will be coalitions of the people talk about coalitions of the willing. I'd like to think about coalitions of the doing. That is already people who are already doing. So we're not pushing through something that you need to persuade somebody. You're already bringing people whose business models are already aligned. So you're talking about the doors are already open. So if we could start with coalition of the doing and those who are already there and see how we grow the pie together. And I don't see anywhere else other than growing the green pie together being the solution for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's about delivery. It's about doing what you can do in terms of it's such a big, it's so enormous, climate change. So getting people to care about it and is sometimes difficult. There was a psychologist, a Jeff Beattie, who wrote on the divided self. I don't know if you've read this book, but essentially it's that division between what people claim to care about and then what they actually do care about, and there's some sort of division in that. So
there is, but also the thing is that we're not competing against other climate issues, right? The challenges we looked at other challenges.
Yes.
I've been into this room many times recently for all sorts of lectures on all sorts of things in the world that is going around, and the problem is that you almost have to ask people to care less about somebody else, which obviously we can't.
Right.
So therefore, we have to find a way. Look, we made lots of mistakes in the first generation of climate solutions, right? We thought that we can have it all. We didn't. So now it's time for us to really deliver things with intersectionality and all that, because unless you do everything and deliver them, we know that it will come back and haunt you anyways.
Understood. Okay, thank you,
Anthony.
And finally, we're going to go to Anthony for your 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, other panelists. I had 3 points I wanted to raise, which I hope amplifies what we've heard from the previous 2 speakers. Firstly, in terms of climate change, where we are, because, we all walked here, unusually sunny, incredibly hot. We are seeing records being broken day after day in terms of the climate impact. I heard on the radio this morning, they were talking about it in Yorkshire, in the north of the UK. It's the driest spring they've ever had, and records go back 200 years. So global temperatures have probably risen about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. It did last year, but in terms of the numbers, it has to be a 10-year average. But if we're assuming that we're in and about that, Bernice talked about the positive nature in terms of the changes that have been seen through climate action, that pledges have driven down from the 3, the 4, the 5 degree predicted increase to 2.7 degrees or 2.9, somewhere around that by the end of this century. But we're on 1.5, and we're talking about potentially doubling that in terms of the increase in global temperature. So the extremes of weather that we're now seeing are just the beginning, and that will have a unprecedented impact in terms of global well-being, the ability to work, as mentioned, the crops that we grow, where they grow, and then of course nature itself. So I would just emphasize that this is just the beginning, and it is there tends to be around a 20 to 30 year lag between the emissions that you put out and the consequences in terms of climatic consequences. So it really is, if we think it's worrying now, this is only going to get worse. So that's the bit of a downside, I would say, or a bit of a downer on the meeting. But I wanted to give 2 positive points. Firstly, in terms of how rapid change can be. So Germany is Europe's largest economy. And I'd just like to take a little poll from people in terms of what percentage of Germany's electricity do people think is currently, and as of the last minute, being generated by renewable energy. So maybe people could raise their hands. Everyone raise their hands, and then I'm going to go down. So who thinks that it is 30%? Anyone? Anyone think it's more than that? 40%? 50%? 60%? Nobody thinks it's 60%. So it's 84% of Germany's electricity, Europe's largest economy, is currently being generated by renewable energy. And if you go back 2 decades, it wouldn't even be half that. And that is because you are seeing a transformation on a sector that is absolutely fundamental for our society at a pace that is unparalleled. And so there are real technological, policy, innovation, public behavior changes that are taking place in a way that we would not have imagined. So that's the upside. A little bit of caution, that is electricity. And when we talk about energy, when we talk about transport, we're way, way behind. But we can electrify many of these systems. So the dawn of electric vehicles and what that means is a promising story. So that's the positive bit. And then my final point is leading to international cooperation. And I think one of the key issues that we are challenged with globally, at least from a Western perspective, is the relationship that we have with China. And the dominance that they have in industry, the dominance they have increasingly in terms of global politics. But in the climate change debate, they are absolutely fundamental. So the UK's emissions are around 1% of the global total. China's emissions are 30%. So what happens in China matters to a unprecedented level in terms of global emissions. But also they are fundamental in terms of the solutions. So I wrote these down. So 80% of global solar panels are made in China, 65% of wind turbines, and 70% of electric vehicles. and they can produce them cheaper and quicker than anyone else. But yet we want to maintain our industry within the EU, within Europe, within the North. But yet, if we say we're going to build our own electric vehicles, our own solar panels, it will cost much, much more, around 3 times as much to make a solar panel in the UK as it is in Europe, and it will take much longer. So there is this balance that we need to have in terms of cooperation and industrial priorities, and that is the challenge that we're facing. And maybe just to finish up on a sort of word of optimism, in terms of China, in the first half of this year, China deployed, so it manufactures for the rest of the world, but it deployed around 200 gigawatts of solar panels. So that's in the first 6 months of this year. And to put that in context, that is more than has ever been deployed in the United States in 6 months. Mm-hmm. If they carry on at the same pace for the rest of this year, they will deploy more solar panels than is currently in the EU 27. So they have huge emissions, but they have the technologies and they have the manufacturing capabilities to help us all reduce our emissions very rapidly. But yet they are perceived as a challenge, and we need to have international cooperation. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to get on with some questions. If you can keep your comments reasonably short and to the point, because we have about 15 minutes that we're going to 15-20 minutes. So first thing is international cooperation. Where are we with international cooperation? To most people, I don't know if you've seen the news recently, but international and cooperation haven't really gone together so well. We've had wars, we've had undermining of international systems, undermining of international law, undermining of the agencies of the United Nations, etc. So going into COP30, how do you feel things are going, and to what extent are people engaging together in terms of their engagement with climate change? Is it all wrapped up in energy security, war, etc.? So perhaps, June, you could take that.
Yes. Okay. In terms of international cooperation, obviously, because of the withdrawal of Trump from Paris Agreement, it is giving some sort of negative impact to the solidarity of the international society towards the combating climate change. And as Bernice said, the rest of the world are united to tackle climate change. But nevertheless, the lack of U.S. presence is having a lot of impact on financial transfer and other matters. So there seems to be a crack in G7 about their position towards climate change. So that is why G7 Kananaskis Summit could not agree on the unified message on climate change. And then the disparity or difference between G7 and BRICS are becoming more and more evident. BRICS summit was held in Brazil this July, and there was no reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius goals or no reference to 2050 carbon neutrality, and instead they called for ever increasing financial transfer from developed countries, and they harshly attacked CBAM. So I think international cooperation current situation is very much challenging. Yes, in the COP, the countries gathering there are talking each other, and they are moving towards the common future. But the tangible outcome is another story.
Bernice, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, obviously, securitization, economic security are key issues. At the same time, what we have also learned as well since the Russian invasion of Ukraine is indeed that fossil fuels can be a source of energy insecurity in a very serious way. What Anthony just outlined as well, there's so much energy security now comes from renewables. So in some sense, the good news part is that there has been a step change on this. At the same time, whether or not the US will play or not, the rest of the world is not waiting at this point. we've seen this picture before. We didn't particularly like the picture back in 2017. At the time, surprising to anybody, sort of subnational collaboration and other forms of collaboration sprang up. So while I don't want to underestimate the challenges around what the current administration in the US will bring, at the same time, I don't think it's a hopeless situation. Mm-hmm. At the same time, what I think is interesting is that Brazil's attitude seems to be that, and that applies as much to BRICS Plus as others, is that sure, we could keep reaffirming things we agreed on. Brazil seems to take the attitude that if things are agreed, let's not open the box. Mm-hmm. So now that may or may not be a hack. That may help us get over this incessant renegotiation that indeed don't move us forward. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I mean, if indeed that is the attitude, then the question becomes whether or not we can focus indeed on the delivery that we were talking about earlier. So even when you are busy fighting with each other, there are things that we all know we need, and that includes how do we get from place one to another. And as I said, how do we deal with the climate impacts that nobody is getting really any better at this point. So I think that sort of around sort of new forms of energy security is definitely key. Another way to think it through is that, look, right now, who is bearing the cost of the fights? Many people are, obviously, many, especially the most vulnerable populations. But actually, surprisingly, not for many to hear, corporations at the moment are the ones who are doubling their supply chains, who are duplicating them, getting rid of the ones they had. And at the moment, they're not passing the cost through to customers either, not because they're green. It's just anything at the moment. So in some sense, I kind of feel that we may have underestimated the potential of corporations in helping us get back to some form of sense and sensibility around whether or not just fighting will actually deliver some of the goals of prosperities and sustainability that we know we need. So I have some hope that sense will eventually come back.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. Add on. Yes, it's a difficult question in terms of you can look at it half full or half empty. The half full is that there are technologies, there are areas in which there is absolute desire to move ahead at full speed. There are so many co-benefits of action on climate change, and Bernie sort of threw out the list, but we shouldn't underestimate in terms of the economics, the security of supply, the health implications of not burning so many fossil fuels. All of these things are driving the energy transition in a significant way. So there's cooperation across all of those areas. But there's also the vested interests, be they companies or countries, that wish the transition not to occur or to occur much slower. They want it to go at a pace that they can manage much more clearly. And I think that is the question, the challenge in terms of cooperation. It can't be a tent that everyone is in because not everyone wants to go in the same direction. So, yeah, you have to break this down. You have to have, as Bernie's talked about, the coalition of the doing. There has to be a group that can move further and faster, and it's not, all countries moving together at the same time.
Okay. Well, you mentioned technology, so we can move on to that. There's we constantly hear of new technologies that are fantastic and that are coming up with solutions all the time. And so I guess Elon Musk is probably sort of the most famous sort of flag bearer for this thing of technology will solve everything. And of course, one of the things we have at the moment is AI and rising use of AI, which at the same time consumes a huge amount of energy. So perhaps you could talk about technology, whether you believe that solutions will be found through technology, or to the degree to which technology is important in the solutions. And also talk a bit about AI, whether you believe that this is going to contribute towards those solutions, even if in the short term it creates or it makes us consume more energy. So who would like to take that?
Okay, I will start. Of course, AI has two sides. The one side, on one hand, AI, in particular training and operating AI models, require large amounts of electricity in data services, data centers. And this may increase greenhouse gas emissions if electricity is not decarbonized. So that is a clear fact. And how much electricity demand will increase, that is still the moot question. There are various projections. And a clear positive impact of the AI is AI can support policy and countermeasures planning by analyzing past weather data and also greenhouse gas emissions to predict future climate change scenarios. So that would be a good, a boon for climate model. And AI has also potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by optimizing the use of renewable energy and also improving energy efficiency more smartly. And finally, AI can also be used for environmental monitoring and natural disaster prediction, helping to minimize damage. So I think, anyway, AI will increasing to be utilized. So we have to live with that. So then what we have to do is how to make best use of AI for our common, goal for climate mitigation and adaptation.
Okay, thanks, Jin. Yes, Bernice.
Well, thank you, Jin, for outlining all the use cases. I was just reading something fascinating last night, thinking about this panel, about how I think this researcher, a great guy, really started this company in Beijing, talked about how the Chinese government has the same attitude as the Silicon Valley tech bros when it comes to whether technology is part of a solution for the future. And they definitely seems to be very engineering obsessed and certainly very interested in technology solutions. And at the same time, I think that technology has to be part of the future. It is part of the future already. How do we do it in such a way that continue to make sure that the clean and green frontier is not breached, but actually maintained? So I think the way AI the way I see it, given the climate impacts we're talking about, the only way that will continue is indeed if the evolution and the exponential growth in AI would be matched by how it really is enabling its own clean energy adoption at the same time. Who would have thought, however, that right now China is the champion for an open, cheap AI model, where the US is putting a gated model of technology, but in a tech bro version. So in a world where things are turned upside down and topsy-turvy in terms of traditional assumptions about the world, I believe that we actually have the kind of opportunities that perhaps we haven't even entertained yet if we continue on this trajectory and not just take Musk as an example. And if indeed, I know very little about AI, just to be clear. I have a lot of opinion like everybody else, but it's not really my area. But what I do observe in terms of global international political economy is that this topsy-turviness about where China and the US is when it comes to sharing and championing of AI technology for the future gives me in some ways some hope that we're not going into one direction only, which is the one where more energy usage, harder to share, poorer countries, less to get from, etc. I hope that we don't get that the sort of traditional trajectory that sometimes we assume.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I'll take a couple of points. I guess earlier on I was being a bit of a tech evangelist, talking about how great it is and how the systems have changed. And I think it is true, but it's not all technologies will deliver these things. And it's interesting to look at which technologies are able to. And it's largely those that are small, modular, and can be replicated very quickly. And you can then get large numbers of companies building these things, learning by doing, efficiency improvements, etc. So, and I could look at some technologies that we have been waiting for a long time, and they haven't progressed. And that sort of development worries me. So, for example, there's what's called DAX, direct air capture and storage, where we will have machines that will suck out the CO2 from the atmosphere and then store the CO2 or use the CO2 in some sort of e-fuel. This is going to take a huge amount of energy, massive amounts of land, massive amounts of construction, and be very expensive. So I would argue it's probably very unlikely. But yet it's built into the models that enable us to carry on in the way that we are, saying, well, don't worry, in the future we'll develop this technology that will come and save us in the future. And I think we need to be very wary of and look with a really critical eye about the future technologies. I think one that I look with the greatest of interest is around electrolyzers. So these are a way in which you will use electricity to then electrolyze water, and that will split it in water into CO2 and hydrogen. And then hydrogen in theory, will be used as an energy storage. It's an energy, so it's a vector. So like batteries, you'll use it on the grids. Potentially, you'll use it in aviation. You'll use it in the manufacture of fuels for shipping, a whole range of issues. But yet we're still waiting, and we don't know whether or not that technology will become modularized in the same way that solar PV is, and we'll be able to deliver it as cheap as chips, or whether or not. And that will be one technology that I would say we should all look out for. Just a final point, if I can, on AI, a little bugbear, a little bit of controversy, if we could have it in the panel. I would argue AI will use more, and computing power will increase. It will require more electricity. In terms of the global shift towards electrification, when you talk about EVs, where you talk about electrification with heat pumps, etc., it's a relatively small increase. And it won't be a large user of electricity compared to all the other things. And I think it's hyped up a bit in order for those people and those companies that are not going to meet their targets in terms of data. So the tech bros, as was talked about, Bernie's talked about, they're using, well, we're going to be massive. We're going to have all of these increases. And then they put forward, I would again, unicorn technologies like fusion. Don't worry. In 20 years' time, we're going to be operating all these fusion plants and our emissions will there be stable. And I just think it's a smoke and mirrors tactic. So look very carefully at the figures in terms of actually how much electricity will be needed in the future, and then don't let the technology companies off the hook in terms of meeting their current emissions reduction targets.
Can I ask him a question?
Sure.
So last week I sat through a couple of days of having somebody talking a lot about this unnamed technology that is small, that is possibly modular, but is not SMR,
Right.
that is sitting on a barge, that is going to be extremely helpful because it's going to be clean, green, heat-free, and is going to power all the AI that we ever needed. And it's a sort of, I mean, obviously, I sort of thought to myself, I better ask Anthony before I let myself drink any Kool-Aid.
What is it?
I'm assuming it's a
It's
kind of nuclear,
It's a small modular reactor.
except that it's not called by that name. It's on a barge.
It's the Russians.
I think it must be, right?
Yeah. It's the Russian floating reactors.
Yeah, that's it. So what do you think about those?
Well, they're small.
Yeah.
They're sort of modular, but they're very, very expensive. And they've made 2 of them in 20 years. So they're not in the same way that I would say solar is, where you have... My favorite story from Chatham House when I was there 2 years ago, we took some Chinese delegation to the northwest of the UK, and we showed them where they were building the new CCS facilities, or proposed CCS facilities. And on that site, it was an old steel mill. They were building a plant to build the pylons for offshore wind. And it looks so impressive. In the UK, you think we don't make anything. We're rubbish at lots of things. But you go there and they were building, the trucks were there building the factory. And they said, if you come back in 3 years, this will be a factory in which we're managing the wind turbine construction. And one of the Chinese delegation turned around and said, we've just broken the record in China for the construction of a new PV plant. It was 72 days. You can build them like this. You can scale them up very quickly. And on your nuclear question, they are small, they are modular, but they're not going to be scaled up in the way that you can and we need to in other areas.
Okay. Well, thank you. We have 19 minutes for questions or that you might have. See a couple of hands going up there. So please keep the questions brief, to the point, and if you wish to direct in particular, there's one there.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. It's very insightful. I have a kind of little disruptor question, right? And if you look at the temperature thing, I'll be very brief, but give me a minute. Why there's no talk about climate reparations? When you say by 1947, we already had crossed 1.1 degrees Celsius, then is it time to speak about climate reparations? We are speaking about ODA, but profit remittances have increased in the last 10 years from 59% to 88%. None of the COPs are speaking about poverty, the biggest question of the paradox of poverty. And World Bank says the below poverty line will increase, or people will go by $6.38. Do you think still there is hope when you're not talking about all these essential questions which define why wealth inequality exists between the North and the South? Thank you.
Jun, you'd like to say that around reparations?
I know that poverty eradication is quite important agenda, and I think that is still is very much important agenda for international community. So that is why the priority on the different 17 SDGs are totally different across developed and developing countries, and going through priorities on each country. Naturally, in developing countries, their priority on poverty eradication or zero hunger is much, much higher than climate mitigation. So this is definitely the first priority to be tackled in global scale. And the Trump administration is in many ways very much controversial, and his new energy secretary, Chris Wright, is also a controversial person in some way. But one thing I could agree with his statement is, the zero poverty by 2050 is more important than zero emission by 2050. So we should make various energy resources available to developing countries so that they could have an access to modern type of energy. And I tend to agree with him. So to my mind, I think for developing countries, the say exit from hunger or exit from poverty is more important than a global agenda. And that is quite understandable to my mind.
Okay, but there's still some questions around accountability, responsibility. Bernice, have you got anything to say on that?
I think that's a very tough one because obviously the Loss and Damage Fund was in part, recognition of damages, and even though it doesn't necessarily go very far back, I just don't really, first of all, I just want to be clear that I don't really follow that part of the debate as much as I should, which to my shame, really. At the same time, I wonder whether or not in the current climate, calling it something else in some ways, even though they're all elephants in the room, right? Whatever you call them, they're all elephants, will actually get more resources on the table that is needed. So I'm of the opinion that if we want more resources on the table, we go with whoever folks would be more likely to help and put stuff in the pot. And at the moment, there are discussions around global solidarity tax, which will lead to different types of, at least, resource generation, but also hopefully distribution as well. So I agree with you that it is an elephant, but there are so many elephants in the room from including often those who are asking for reparations aren't necessarily the most vulnerable groups either. They're often those who don't want to do more as well. Many of the middle income, or emerging economies are also interested in that agenda in a way that perhaps we have to ask about motives as well. So I guess my view on this is I don't know the answer. It is one of the elephants. If we could figure out a way to do it, great. If you think that we could generate more resources that would really deliver what Jun said we should deliver, fantastic. But I'm not seeing any new momentum just yet, other than those who have been speaking about it for quite a while. And I would happily stand corrected if I were wrong. But
No discussion about global solidarity tax anymore?
There is, yeah.
There is.
And
how about the prospect?
Well, it's moving. It's
Very
moving.
slowly.
It's moving. It will be continued to be discussed. And I thought that at FF in Seville last week, my understanding is that the discussion continues. The question is whether the supporter groups grow.
Yeah, because without such kind of innovative financing, there is no way out to talk about taxpayers' money from developed countries. That is quite limited, and also the increasing number of the finance is moving towards defense budget now. So I think we need to have a completely fresh idea how to mobilize the financial resources for developing countries.
But then, do you think reparation is an angle to take? Because I don't know how to answer that question.
Anthony, do you have anything? Can you wait for the mic because for the recording?
Just one point to add. I agree. Maybe that might be a contested idea whether reparations is a point. But ODA profit remittances are increasing. So do we think, and that's the humanitarian aid agencies who said that from 2006 until 2010, Sub-Saharan Africa profit remittances back to the developed countries increased from 59% to 83%. The recorded data. So is it a really question of money, or there's something bigger, like you said, there's an elephant in the room we don't identify? But thank you.
Anything else? One thing I'd like to pick up is on budgets within countries towards climate mitigation and these sorts of projects at a time when tax bases in some places are getting smaller and where there is in many places a desire to spend more money on military, on arms, and of course to the detriment of spending on services, on education within given countries. To what degree do you feel at the moment there's a squeeze, and how is it affecting negotiations?
Can I say? I mean, I just think in terms of mitigation, we need to understand that the costs of the non-fossil fuel technologies will continue to fall, or are continuing to fall. IEA says that solar is the cheapest form of electricity ever generated in history. So there are ways in which we will see money being saved rather than exported in terms of buying fossil fuels. So we need to reframe the narrative a bit in terms of energy transition being expensive. So the energy transition may having some initial higher costs, but in the long run, it's the only way in which you will be able to balance your budget. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the recognition that if you don't address climate change, it becomes more and more expensive. So the adaptation costs will increase. And so there's lots of analysis from all around the world that talks about delaying action will increase those costs. So I think some of it's a narrative question, and it is a absolute there are, as more money is spent, is moved into security, some of that is hard security, but some of that is also soft security. And if you look within the 5% budgets that the UK has pledged, there's 1.5% that is for domestic security. Energy is included, adaptation can be included. So there's a way in which you can, again, meet two objectives using some of that money. But yeah, it absolutely is going to be challenging.
A couple of things. I agree with Anthony that the clean technology is getting cheaper and cheaper thanks to China's mass production, like solar panel and windmills and battery and so forth. But we also need to recognize that the larger, penetration of intermittent renewable will require the balancing, the integration cost, like a battery or extending grid system, and also adjustment operation of fossil fuel plant and so forth. So this is the additional cost for increasing the share of renewables. So that aspect needs to be taken into account. And the second thing is China is a producer of very cheap, clean technologies. But China is also, again, very much dominant in critical minerals, which is important not only for clean energy transition, but also many military technologies. And this is creating a real security problem among the developed country, in particular G7 country. So that is why the G7 could agree on critical mineral action program, even though they differ their opinion about climate change. So they can be united. So they have a strong sense of urgency about over-reliance on critical minerals to China. Then finally, the squeeze budget in each country. And sometimes the developed country do very much crazy things, including Japan. The crazy thing Japanese government is doing is, on one hand, they are providing huge amount of subsidy to gasoline and electricity for reducing energy costs for the general public. So that is several trillion Japanese yen. So if that money could have been used for mitigation or financial transfer to developing countries, then that will change a lot. But in order to get the support from voters, in particular immediately before the upper house election, the government tends to spend very stupid money for stupid things.
Actually, it's funny. I was waiting for you to raise critical minerals, partly because Japan has been so angry with the rest of the G7 for so many years for not taking it seriously until the Inflation Rate Reduction Act. I think that the budget was always squeezed, is what I was going to say. In a way, I think that we will be kidding ourselves to think that this is really different from the past. It narratively, I think in terms of narrative, that's absolutely true. But at the same time, if we did do something not very well the last decade or so, is when we didn't make sure that the code deliveries are part of the discussion. And so perhaps this is a chance for us to make sure that all the things we do for the future will deliver all the other objectives as well. So, I mean, I'm not trying to be optimistic because there's no reason to try, but there is no reason to be pessimistic yet on the basis that the solutions are there and indeed the problems don't go away and they will cost more if you don't solve them.
I like that. Delay your pessimism.
Quite.
Okay. Any other questions? One there.
I have a question about the drop in the general public's opinion about the importance of climate change and how it should be addressed. And is there maybe a certain lassitude? And is there anything that the international community could do to heighten the importance and boost it back up to the top of the agenda? I think we need to convince the general population that this matters, whatever wars we may be involved in.
Well, so I hosted a couple of discussions on this the last couple of months because this is obviously the question on everyone's mind at the moment. I think that the challenge is indeed, as I said earlier, that in order for people to care more about something, you need them to care less about something they really, really care about right now, which could be about food and energy prices, for example, which is obviously not something that we can not tackle. So the answer to the question is what I was saying earlier, which is, first of all, we need to make sure that it is delivering all the other things that other people do care about. And secondly, perhaps don't promise things that we can't deliver, because that is one of the ways you erode trust, is when you promise someone that things will be cheaper and they're not. And that would be one way to erode trust. But also at the same time, I mean, I think June was right to point out, for example, that there are subsidies for example, high emissive sectors and environmentally harmful ones that actually do us no good, which will be the kind of things that perhaps we can remove first and actually help build some of the trust around it as well. And last but certainly not least, we people, in fact, I was having this fight with my fella this morning with this discussion. People don't really agree with somebody else because they get persuaded, right? They come. I remember this is, in fact, a Japanese diplomat who taught me that, Mr. Korobesho-san, who taught me that people don't really listen to somebody else and change their mind, but you have to let them argue themselves out of their own argument. So in some sense, it's about making sure that you meet people where they are at and let them come to their conclusion themselves. Because I know that this is not the most efficient way of doing things, but I wonder whether or not there were ever shortcuts anyways, until people actually genuinely find them for themselves.
Okay, we've got...
Can I just do 30
Yes.
seconds on that?
Yep,
one,
sure.
Sorry. Just because last week there was a Eurobarometer poll published on climate change, which goes across the EU, and I just pulled out the figures. So 85% of Europeans consider climate change to be a serious threat and support urgent action to address it. 88% back stronger EU action on renewables and energy efficiency. 85% agree that tackling climate change should be a priority to improve public health and quality of life. So there is public support, would be my message, and maybe it's the politicians and the industry that aren't listening to it.
And
Or that some parts of the media wanted people to believe that the public support is waning. You're quite right.
you might be surprised, but even in the United States, the majority of people are believing in climate change risk. And they support stronger government action, but they do not support paying more.
That's the
biggest
that's the
problem.
other part.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left, because we've got a couple of people from Chatham House. We've only got 2 minutes, so I think who knows what the Chatham House rule is? one, two, in that case, could you educate us on what the Chatham House rule is and why it's important? And because this is something I use within classes at graduate school level, and I think it's an important thing to know. And because it's an education conference, here's a takeaway.
Well, it's been a privilege for many of us who had the pleasure of working at Chatham House in the past. And it is an organization that came out of, in fact, one of my favorite stories, that one of Anthony's uncle was actually one of the founders back in the day, but they came back from the peace conference, decided that they didn't really want to have the Second World War, and they set up in the UK the British Institute for International Affairs, and in the US the Council on Foreign Relations. You can talk about more of your personal history with this, but in order to enhance the prospect of whatever you might want to achieve, it was deemed important that whatever you hear in a conversation, you could repeat the content, but not where you heard it and who said it. Where you heard it was the original one, but now it's who said it. So the idea is that you encourage frank exchanges so that you can talk about what is being talked about, but not who said it, to protect the identity of those who are in the room. So that you encourage more frank discussions among people who may wish to find common grounds, which otherwise, if identified,
and it helps engage with the ideas rather than who said.
Yeah. And for me, the important bit is
your uncle.
So anyway, but the important thing is that it's not a confidential conversation. It's that the ideas are shared, and so therefore it helps enhance those discussions more widely. And so that's it's a key point about confidence and trust. Yeah.
And it's a really good thing. You can look it up. It's very, very simple, and it's an excellent tool to employ in your classrooms. We are out of time, and I'd like to thank our panelists, June Arima, Anthony Froggatt, and Bernice Lee, for the presentation today. Thank you very much.